My name is Sophia Caldwell. I am 30 years old. Hey everyone! If you've ever poured years into a job thinking your boss saw you as the steady one who kept everything afloat, only to have that same person look you dead in the eye and deliver the kind of last warning that makes the desert air feel like it's closing in around you, then you already know how quickly loyalty can curdle into something ugly. I'm sitting here in my new little place just outside Bend, staring out at the high desert scrub, and I still get that chaotic swirl in my chest when I replay it. The kind of swirl where 1 minute you're calm and composed on the outside, the next your mind is racing through every conversation you ever had with him, wondering how you missed the knife he was sharpening the whole time. It started, or at least the final unraveling started, at the company's private retreat compound, tucked into the high desert hills just north of Bend, Oregon. My boss, Tyler Ramirez, had insisted on bringing the whole leadership team out there for what he called a strategy reset. The place was all glass walls and polished concrete perched on a rise with views that made you feel like you owned the horizon. I'd always loved the way the light hit the sagebrush in the late afternoon, but that day the sun felt too bright, too exposing. I'd been with the company almost 6 years, starting as a junior analyst and working my way up to senior operations lead because I noticed things other people didn't. Patterns in the numbers, quiet shifts in people's stories. I was observant like that, composed even when things got messy, which is probably why my boss kept me close for so long. Or at least that's what I told myself until the afternoon he cornered me in the main conference room overlooking the empty pool deck. My coworker Grace Hale was already there, perched on the edge of the long table like she belonged in the boss's chair. I'd introduced her earlier in the story as my coworker, the one who always had Tyler's ear and a smile that never quite reached her eyes when I walked into the room. The three of us were supposed to be reviewing quarterly projections, but the folder in front of Tyler was too thin, too deliberate. He slid it across the glass tabletop toward me without a word at first. Then came the devastating last warning delivered in that calm, almost bored tone he used when he was about to pull the rug out. "Sophia, we're at a crossroads here," he said, leaning back in his chair like he was discussing the weather. "The board's breathing down my neck about liquidity, and your share allocation from the early days is creating some complications. Sign the transfer docs today, shift 25% of your equity into the new holding structure, and we keep things friendly. Refuse and I'll have no choice but to start the formal review process. You know how these things go in a tight-knit team like ours. People talk. Old allies start to wonder if maybe you're the one holding us back." My stomach did that unstable flip, the kind where your thoughts scatter like wind across the desert floor. I'd built those shares myself through sweat and long nights when the company was still just a scrappy startup. Tyler had always praised me for it. Grace had nodded along, calling me the backbone. Now here they were, acting like my stake was some kind of obstacle. I kept my voice even the way I always did when chaos tried to creep in. "Tyler, those shares were part of my compensation package. I earned them. What's really going on here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, motioned for Grace to follow, and headed toward the glass doors that opened onto the desert path. "Take a walk, Sophia. Clear your head. Think about what the team needs from you right now. We'll be back at the main house in an hour. If the papers aren't signed by then, well, you know where the gate is." The way he said it carried that sharp little jab like he was doing me a favor by giving me time to come to my senses. Grace gave me one of those half smiles as she trailed after him, her heels clicking on the concrete like she couldn't wait to get away from the conversation. I sat there for a long minute after they left the desert wind, rattling the glass just enough to make the room feel alive and unsteady. My mind was already racing through the last year of strange little things I'd noticed: missing wire transfers, sudden new vendor contracts that didn't add up the way Tyler and Grace had started finishing each other's sentences in meetings. I'd stayed quiet, observant, because I thought loyalty mattered. But something in that moment shifted. The past was catching up, and it had teeth. I stepped outside onto the winding path that cut through the high desert compound. The sun was dipping lower, painting the sagebrush in harsh gold and shadow. My phone had no signal out here by design. Tyler always said it helped us focus. I walked for maybe 10 minutes, letting the dry air steady me even as my thoughts spun in chaotic loops. That's when I spotted the manila envelope half tucked under a bench near the meditation garden. It looked like it had slipped out of someone's bag. I picked it up, hard hammering in that unstable way it does when you know you're not supposed to look, but you can't stop yourself. Inside were legal papers, drafts of share dilution agreements dated months ago, with my name forged in places I'd never signed. And underneath them, a single folded letter on company stationery, addressed to no one, never sent. The handwriting was Grace's. My coworker had written it, confessing everything in black ink that bled a little at the edges, like she'd been crying when she put the words down. The affair with Tyler. The way they'd siphoned assets into offshore accounts over the last 18 months. How they'd manipulated the books so my original shares looked like they'd been voluntarily transferred, when, in reality, the money behind them had vanished long ago. She'd even admitted they planned to use the retreat to force my hand because I was the last holdout who still had the documentation to blow it open. I stood there in the desert heat, the paper trembling in my hands, and for a second, the world felt completely unstable, like the ground under the compound might crack open and swallow the whole place. My boss and my coworker hadn't just betrayed the company. They'd been cheating on every level, personal and professional, and they'd chosen this isolated high desert spot to corner me because they thought I'd fold under pressure. But I didn't fold. I slipped the letter and papers into my bag, turned around, and started walking back toward the main house with a quiet resolve that felt like armor. By the time I reached the glass-walled living area, Tyler and Grace were already there, laughing over drinks like nothing had happened. My partner, Jordan Forrester, was supposed to join us later that evening for the team dinner, but I hadn't told him the full extent of my suspicions yet. I needed to keep things composed on the surface. I sat down across from my boss, met his eyes, and slid the unsigned folder back to him. I'm not signing anything, Tyler, not until I understand exactly where the missing assets went. The room went still in that chaotic electric way right before everything explodes. Grace's laugh died in her throat. My boss leaned forward, that last warning tone sharpening into something colder. You really want to play this game? Sophia, after everything I've done for you, I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at them both and said the words that had been building for months. I've been paying attention, and I think it's time the rest of the team did too. The silence after my words hung in the air, like the desert heat pressing down on the glass walls of the main house, thick and unsteady. My boss stared at me across the polished table, his jaw tightening. In that way I'd seen 100 times in board meetings when something threatened his carefully built narrative. My coworker shifted beside him, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of her chair as if the floor might give way any second. I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap, the manila envelope resting heavy in my bag, like a secret that had finally decided to surface after all this time. My boss leaned forward slowly, his voice dropping into that low, controlled register he used when he wanted to make you feel small, without raising a single decibel. Sophia, you're really going to stand there and imply something like that after everything this company has given you? We brought you into the inner circle. We trusted you with those shares from the beginning. He glanced at my coworker, who nodded quickly, her expression a mix of concern and something sharper underneath. You've been under a lot of pressure lately. Maybe this retreat wasn't the best idea for someone who's been spiraling. The words landed like a sudden gust across the high desert floor, kicking up dust in my chest. Inside, my thoughts were a chaotic whirl, flashes of late nights, reviewing spreadsheets that never quite added up the way my coworker had started lingering in my boss's office with the door closed just a little too long. The quiet transfers I'd flagged months ago, only to be told it was just accounting housekeeping. But outwardly, I kept my face calm, observant, the way I always had when the ground felt like it was shifting beneath me. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope laying the legal papers and that single folded letter on the table between us. The handwriting on the letter was unmistakably my coworker's, the ink slightly smudged, as if she'd written it in a rush of guilt she never meant to send. I didn't say anything at first. I just let them see it. My coworker's eyes widened, and she lunged halfway across the table before catching herself, her hand freezing midair. That's private. She stammered, her voice cracking in a way that made the whole room feel even more unstable, like the polished concrete under our feet might crack open and reveal everything they'd buried. My boss snatched the papers, first scanning them with a speed that told me he already knew what was in them. The letter detailed it all in her own words. The affair that had been going on for over a year, the way they'd manipulated my business shares, and those of a few other early employees into new holding structures that funneled everything offshore. The assets that had essentially vanished long ago under layers of creative accounting they thought no one would ever trace back. She'd even written about how they planned to use this very retreat to corner me, to force the signature because I was the last one with the original documentation that could unravel the whole thing. The chaotic energy in the room spiked instantly. My boss slammed the letter down his face, flushing red against the neutral tones of his desert casual polo. This is a fabrication, Sophia. You're clearly not thinking straight. Grace would never. He cut himself off, shooting her a look that was supposed to be supportive, but came across as pure panic. My coworker was already backing away from the table, her composure fracturing into something raw and defensive. You must have stolen that from my things. This is insane. You're the one who's been acting erratic, questioning every decision, making the team uncomfortable. I sat there, letting their words swirl around me like the unpredictable high desert winds outside the glass. But inside, I felt that quiet empowerment steadying my spine. I'd always been the observant one, the composed one who noticed the patterns others ignored. Now those patterns were staring back at them in black and white. I didn't steal anything, I said evenly, my voice cutting through the rising tension without a single waver. It was left behind. Accidentally, I suppose. But the past has a way of catching up when you least expect it. That was when the secondary conflict started to creep in, the kind that made everything feel even more unstable. My mentor and longtime colleague, Amanda Grant, had been scheduled to join us for the afternoon strategy session. She'd been the one who'd guided me through my first few years here, always the voice of quiet reason in the background. She walked in, right then tablet in hand, her usual warm smile fading the moment she sensed the thick air in the room. I'd confided bits and pieces to her over the months about my growing suspicions, trusting her as the steady ally who'd always had my back. But as my boss quickly spun the story, painting me as the unstable one who'd somehow gotten hold of private documents and was now making wild accusations. Amanda hesitated. She glanced at the letter on the table, then at me, and I saw the shift in her eyes, that subtle pull away, as she murmured something about needing to check on the rest of the team. Maybe we should all take a breath. She said, her tone careful, almost apologetic, before excusing herself to the side patio. It stung more than I expected, watching an old ally start to distance herself like that, choosing the safer path of team unity over standing with the truth. My boss seized on the moment, pressing harder, his voice gaining that unstable edge, as he paced the length of the conference room. Sign the transfer today, Sophia, and we can forget this ever happened. Refuse, and I'll make sure every executive in this industry hears about how you tried to sabotage the company from within. Old allies like Amanda won't stick around for that kind of drama. You know how these circles work. People pull away when things get messy. My coworker nodded along, though her hands were trembling now, the cheating karma of their affair hanging unspoken between them like a live wire. She added her own jab voice, laced with false concern. We've all invested so much in you. Don't throw it away because you're seeing shadows where there aren't any. I could feel the chaos building inside me, thoughts racing in unstable loops. The vanished assets, the forged signatures on those share documents, the way they'd used my loyalty against me for so long. But I stayed composed, observing every twitch, every exchanged glance. That's when I decided to loop in Derek Donovan, our legal ally, who'd flown in for the retreat as a neutral advisor on some compliance matters. I stepped out briefly onto the path, under the pretense of getting air, pulling out my phone where the signal flickered just enough. I texted him a quick summary, and attached a photo of the letter asking him to meet me discreetly by the meditation garden. He responded almost immediately, agreeing to come, but even his reply carried a cautious note that made the ground feel like it was shifting again. When he arrived a few minutes later, tall and measured in his button-down, he listened as I showed him everything. For a moment he looked supportive, murmuring about potential fiduciary issues and how we could document it properly. But as my boss spotted us from the house and started walking over with my coworker in tow, Derek's posture changed. He glanced toward the main building, then back at me. Sophia, this is delicate. I'm here to advise the company as a whole. Maybe it's best if we handle this through official channels later. Another old ally pulling away the secondary conflict, layering on top of the betrayal like another layer of desert dust. The confrontation escalated right there on the path as the sun dipped lower, casting long, unstable shadows across the sagebrush. My boss arrived breathing hard, demanding the envelope back and threatening to call the board right then to have me removed for creating a hostile environment. My coworker stood beside him, arms crossed her earlier panic, now masked with righteous anger. You're the one who's been manipulating things behind the scenes, she accused, even though the letter in my hands proved the opposite. The words flew back and forth in that chaotic swirl, accusations about the shares I'd earned, fair and square claims that the assets hadn't vanished, but had been reallocated for growth, all while the truth of their personal entanglement simmered just beneath the surface. I held my ground quietly empowered, pointing out the dates on the documents that showed the manipulation had started long before any of my questions. But the real turning point came when my partner Jordan pulled up the long driveway in his truck, dust kicking up behind him as he arrived for the evening team dinner. I'd texted him earlier to come early, sensing I might need someone in my corner. He stepped out, reading the tension immediately, but even he paused when my boss pulled him aside for a quick word. I watched from a distance as Jordan's expression shifted, that familiar supportive look, fracturing just a little under the weight of whatever version my boss was spinning. Old allies pulling away on every side now, the social circle at the retreat starting to fracture in real time. Derek lingered nearby. Amanda had rejoined the group, but kept her distance, and the whole compound felt like it was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. I slipped the letter back into my bag, heart pounding in that unstable rhythm, but my mind was already turning toward the next step, quietly empowered, even as everything around me spun into chaos. My boss caught my eye from across the gathering group, his final warning hanging in the cooling desert air like a promise of more to come. This isn't over, Sophia. Not by a long shot. The words still echoed in the cooling desert air as my boss turned on his heel, Grace trailing close behind him like a shadow she couldn't shake. The high desert compound felt even more unstable in that moment, the long shadows stretching across the sagebrush, as if the ground itself was shifting under the weight of everything we'd just dragged into the open. I stood there on the winding path, the manila envelope tucked safely back in my bag, my heart racing in those chaotic looping bursts that made my thoughts feel like they were scattering in every direction at once. Yet somehow beneath it all, that quiet empowerment held steady the same observant calm I'd carried through 6 years of noticing patterns no one else wanted to see. My partner Jordan stepped up beside me, his hand brushing mine in silent support, but even he looked rattled by the way the team was already starting to cluster near the glass doors of the main house, whispering in low, uneasy tones. My boss didn't let it drop. He spun back around almost immediately, his voice rising just enough to carry across the open space that last warning edge, sharpening into something raw and desperate. You think you can just drop something like that and walk away, Sophia? Those shares were always part of the team structure. You're the one who's been stirring up trouble, questioning every move we've made for the last year. Grace stood shoulder to shoulder with him now, her face flushed in the fading light, her usual composed mask cracking wide open. This is exactly why we brought you out here. She added, her words tumbling out in an unstable rush. To get you to see reason. but if you're going to accuse us of manipulating things, maybe it's time the rest of the team hears how you've been the one holding back growth. The cheating karma of it all hung between them like a live wire. The undelivered letter in my bag, proof of the personal entanglement that had poisoned everything else. The secondary conflict flared hotter. Then the old allies pulling away in real time as the group gathered on the patio. Amanda Grant, my longtime mentor who had guided me through those early chaotic days when the company was still finding its feet, lingered at the edge of the circle, her arms crossed tight. She'd been the one I confided in about the odd discrepancies I'd spotted in the books, and for a moment I thought she might speak up. Instead, she glanced between me and my boss, murmuring something about needing to review the numbers herself before jumping to conclusions. Derek Donovan, the legal advisor who had seemed supportive when I showed him the documents earlier, shifted uncomfortably and checked his phone, stepping back as if the whole scene was suddenly too messy to touch. Even Jordan, my rock through all of this, hesitated for a beat when my boss pulled him aside again, whispering urgently about how unstable I'd become lately. The social circle at the retreat, the executives, the board liaison, Rebecca Lang, who had flown in for the strategy session, and the senior colleague Ethan Voss, who handled our biggest accounts, was fracturing right in front of me. Old loyalties cracking under the pressure of my boss's version of events. It felt chaotic the way trust could dissolve so fast in the desert wind, but I kept my breathing, even observing every subtle retreat, every averted gaze. I didn't chase them. I simply walked back toward the main house with Jordan at my side, the envelope a quiet anchor in my bag. Inside, the team had already started murmuring louder, the polished concrete floors amplifying every uneasy shuffle. My boss paced the length of the living area glass walls, reflecting his frantic movements like a funhouse mirror of his crumbling control. "We're freezing her access effective immediately," he announced to the group voice. "Unsteady now. Until we sort this out internally. Those assets she's questioning. They were reallocated months ago for legitimate growth. The past catches up to everyone. Sophia, but you're the one who's going to regret forcing our hand." Grace nodded along, but her hands were shaking as she poured herself a drink from the sidebar, the affair they'd hidden for over a year, now threatening to spill out with every defensive word. That's when the real unraveling began. Rebecca Lang, the board liaison, who had always struck me as fair but distant, stepped forward after reviewing the photos I quietly shared on my phone. Her eyes widened at the details in the letter, the explicit admissions of the personal relationship between my boss and Grace, the way they'd manipulated my business shares and siphoned funds into offshore accounts until the original assets had essentially vanished long ago. This changes everything, she said, her tone measured but firm, the first clear sign that the social circle was starting to turn. Ethan Voss, the executive, who had worked closest with my boss on the biggest deals, pulled out his own tablet and started cross-checking the dates, his face hardening as the discrepancies piled up. One by one, the murmurs shifted from defending my boss to questioning him outright. Old allies who had pulled away at first were now openly distancing themselves, the chaotic energy in the room flipping as people realized the betrayal ran deeper than any of us had admitted. My boss tried to regain control, slamming a hand on the glass table, but it only made the instability more obvious. "This is all a misunderstanding," he insisted, but his voice cracked. Grace's composure shattered completely, then the cheating karma finally boiling over as she turned on him in front of everyone. "You promised this would be clean, Tyler. You said no one would trace it back if we kept the shares under wraps." The room went dead silent. The affair, the manipulated documents, the vanished assets, it all spilled out in her unstable outburst, the undelivered confession letter now serving as the final nail. The team watched in stunned silence as my boss's empire of half-truths collapsed around him, the social circle abandoning him and Grace in real time. Rebecca Lang made a quiet call to the board chair right there on speaker, her voice steady as she outlined the evidence. Ethan Voss stepped away from my boss entirely, murmuring that he couldn't be associated with this kind of exposure. In the middle of the chaos, Amanda pulled me aside near the meditation garden path where it had all started. Her face was composed, but there was a quiet resolve in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "Sophia, I need you to know something," she said softly, the desert night air wrapping around us like a steadying breath. "I was the one who left that envelope where you'd find it. I'd been piecing together the same patterns you noticed, but I couldn't confront them directly without risking my own position. I hoped you'd be the observant one who finally brought it into the light." The ending twist landed like a gentle but firm hand on my shoulder. My mentor, my quiet ally all along, had been working behind the scenes in her own composed way, never pulling away completely, but waiting for the right moment to tip the scales. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the kind of resilient support that reminded me I hadn't been fighting alone. The next few days unfolded in that same chaotic swirl, but with a quiet empowerment guiding me through every step. The board moved fast once the evidence was verified. My boss and Grace were placed on immediate administrative leave, their access to accounts frozen, while an external audit confirmed the assets had vanished long ago through layers of share manipulation and personal diversions. The social circle that had once orbited them so tightly scattered completely colleagues who had nodded along, now distanced themselves publicly. Old allies like Derek and even Jordan's initial hesitation giving way to full support as the truth settled. I watched it all from a distance, the high desert compound no longer feeling like a trap, but like the place where everything finally broke open. My shares, the ones they'd tried to dilute and steal, were secured and restored through legal channels, the very documentation I'd protected becoming the foundation for my next chapter. By the time the dust settled 2 weeks later, I had severed every tie. No contact with my boss, no lingering in the toxic circles that had enabled the betrayal. I walked away from the company entirely taking the restored equity and turning it into something new, a small consulting practice focused on helping other professionals spot those same quiet manipulations before they swallowed them whole. Jordan and I found a modest place just outside Bend, the high desert views reminding me daily of the freedom that came without a shred of guilt. The past had caught up exactly as it was meant to, and in letting it go, I chose peace every single morning. No more chaotic loops wondering if I'd been blind, just the quiet victory of knowing I had observed, endured, and emerged stronger on the other side. Looking back now, sitting here with a sagebrush stretching out under a clear sky, I feel nothing but that resilient, quiet victory. The betrayal from my boss and my coworker had been shocking in its layers, the manipulated shares, the hidden affair, the way they'd tried to corner me at the retreat, but it forced me to see what real loyalty looked like. The ones who truly stood by me, even quietly, became the foundation I built on, and the ones who pulled away. They taught me that no contact isn't a loss. It's the clearest path to freedom. I choose peace daily, now, setting boundaries that protect the life I've rebuilt one observant step at a time. Thank you for listening to my story. Have you set boundaries with someone who tried to take more than they ever gave? Drop your thoughts. In the comments, I read every single one, and you're not alone in choosing yourself.